Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Have you had your coffee today? Have you had enough? What is enough coffee? Organic Man Coffee Trike might not be able to tell you how much is enough, but they can at least get you going in the right direction. 45001 McPherson, anytime between 6:30 a.m. and 7 p.m., except Sundays, just like Chick-fil-A. It's just too far to drive. You can visit organicmancoffeetrike.shop and get the best coffee on the planet. I was invited to sit in on Paranormal Rundown last week. It was interesting and exciting, a very different kind of show. We talked about a lot of subjects like haunted locations and UFOs and things that interested all, what were there, six of us, I believe? You can find their show on just about every platform out there. Vic Hermanson, the guy that invited me, also has his own podcast called Trailer Park Terrors with an S on the end. If you don't put the S on the end, you wind up getting some kind of strange music. His show is kind of like mine if I had a better education and better sound equipment and things like that. Check him out. If you like my show, you'll probably like his too. Trailer Trash Terrors, that you can also find on any podcast platform. Vic sent me suggestion for my next show, and I looked into it. Once I started reading, I was hooked. I don't usually say this, but it's not really that kind of show that you want your kids to listen to. It's a bit disturbing to say the least. Uh, er, I'll say it this time just to be on the safe side. It's a scary story, and it's true. It's scary and it's disturbing at the same time. Things have gone on all over the world that make people say, what do you expect from those people in that country? Well, this took place right here in the United States in Indiana. Rhoda Derry was born October 10th, 1834, in Fayette County, Indiana. Jacob and Rachel Derry had 10 children, and Rhoda was the youngest. The family moved to a farm in Adams County, Illinois, in Lima Township, about 10 miles north of Quincy, along the Mississippi River. My cats are going nuts for some odd reason. Most of Rhoda's first years went unrecorded. No reason to document the life of a young girl growing up on a farm in Indiana. She must have had a normal childhood. Her family didn't have much money. The farm was typical of the time. Kids would help out and work the fields. A lot of people back then had lots of kids because that way they could work a lot more of their farm. At around 16 years of age, Rhoda discovered boys. She looked around and found one that she liked. To make life even better, he liked her as well. Charles Phoenix lived on the next farm over. The two got along, and as time marched on, they began making plans. Well, the best laid plans of mice. From what I could find, Rhoda Deary grew up in a family with just enough money to eat. You might say they were kind of poor. I couldn't find much about the Phoenix family. They also had a huge farm, and they had a huge pile of money to go with it. The boy's mother and possibly his father weren't very happy knowing that their son was looking to marry the girl next door. His mother wanted him to marry somebody in high society, somebody who also had money. as if this might elevate her to a high society as well. The mother wanted to derail Rhoda and Charles' future plans. While researching any show, I run into several situations. One, the most common, is there will be dozens of websites that all say exactly the same thing, as if they're simply cutting and pasting from each other's websites. I found a lot of not disparaging, a lot of sites that had different stories about Rhoda. Some said it was one way and some said it was the other. One line of thought goes that Rhoda's grandmother, Mary Deary, had been a witch. I found some people saying that Mary had been accused of witchcraft, while others said she was actually a practitioner of the dark arts. In the late 17 and early 1800s, witches were no longer being officially prosecuted, but some folks were both scared and they hated witches. If they couldn't hang them from a tree, they might run them out of town. Mary Molly Deary, along with her husband, a Hessian soldier, the Hessian soldiers were German soldiers who served as auxiliaries in the British Army during the American Revolution. Uh, Molly's husband was named Valentine, and I believe his nickname was Felty. He came to the Americas with the British Army. At the time of the Revolutionary War, British soldiers, even the ones from other countries, weren't allowed to bring wives or children with them to the colonies. It just wasn't done. Well, Molly dressed up to look like a man. She even went so far as to put on a Hessian uniform so she could be with her husband and arrive in the colonies at the expense of the royal crown. She even fought in a few battles alongside Valentine. Seeing the writing on the wall, the couple left the British Army and they joined the Continental Army, where Molly continued to fight alongside her husband. She must have been quite a character. At the end of the war, the couple moved to Pennsylvania. It is believed that Molly took on the life of a young wife and mother, but she seemed to also have some kind of enchantment in her life. Their animals never fell sick or died. Her husband and children were always healthy. In a time when sickness and death were common, her family managed to avoid both. People began to say she was a witch. This didn't concern most people. Instead, they would turn to Molly whenever anyone was sick or there was some kind of a problem on the farm. Farmers turned to the witch for advice on how to best treat their sick animals. Young women turned to her for love spells, and the town began to depend on her to prevent diseases and death. The Witch of Fayette County eventually earned the title of Old Moll Deary. When Moll's son Jacob married Rachel, Rachel wasn't happy knowing that her mother-in-law was a well-known witch. She did everything in her power to get the family far from Moll. I imagine as Rhoda was growing up, she probably heard nothing but bad things about her grandmother and witches in general. When Charles' parents learned the two planned to marry a couple of years later, they threatened Rhoda with witchcraft. The boy's parents believed that Rhoda was involved in witchcraft. Rhoda might have cast a spell on their young son, causing him to fall in love with her. What other reason could there be? Somehow the boy's mother had found out about Old Moll and used this information to drive a wedge between the young couple. She either told Charles that Rhoda was a witch, or she told Rhoda that she was going to cast a spell on her, or possibly a curse using some local witch. Like that song, I Put a Spell on You. The one by, what's his name? The screaming guy, not the. Yeah, anyway. Probably due to the things her mother had said, Rhoda was terrified of witches. She began to hear and see things at night while she was trying to sleep. An evil spirit was coming to visit late at night. This entity became known as Old Scratch. Old Scratch or Mr. Scratch is a nickname for the devil. Was it these late night visits, or her thinking her one true love was taken away from her? Either way, Rhoda had a mental breakdown. Many people believe it was the threat from Charles's parents combined with her fear of witches that caused this mental problem. Her instability grew by the day. Days after the curse, Rhoda told her family that she had spotted Satan lurking in physical form and that he looked like a wild beast. She believed the devil himself was pursuing her. One time while visiting her sister, Rhoda said that she could see Mrs. Phoenix sitting in the corner of the room, and she believed this old woman was going to try and torment her for the rest of her life. Her future was going to become one long nightmare, and she was right. Rhoda began seeing witches flying around their house at night. These creatures would come inside and try to attack her. She would tell her family, but they never saw anything. Rhoda went from bad to worse. She began running around sin ropa. She would take off all of her clothes and run around the farm. Sometimes she would do this in town. This was the Victorian times. You didn't act like this. Women were expected to wear these floor length dresses, and men wore suits and neckties, and even when they went to bed at night, they were fully clothed. She would suddenly begin screaming or crying for no visible reason. It wasn't long before professional advice was needed. Illinois was in the rudimentary stages of mental instability, and it just, they didn't understand it. The family, Rhoda's family, tried to find professional help, but nobody knew what was going on. They turned to, I don't want to call it a care facility. How about a jail for the mentally unstable? Of course, the folks back then called it a hospital. These places have as much to do with hospitals as politicians have to do with the truth. In 1856, she became simply unmanageable. So her father took Rhoda to Jacksonville and placed her in the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane. What a name. While there, the authorities could not keep her in her room. They would lock the door at night, but in the morning, Rhoda would be out on the grounds, walking around, sometimes with nothing on. When asked who let her out, she would sometimes say that Mrs. Phoenix, other times it was Mr. Scratch, had unlocked the door, led her out past the guard, and then opened the front door as well. When the keepers of the asylum brought her back to the building, she would often say that she was not insane, but she didn't know what was the matter with her. Although the asylum was said to be a benevolent location, it had no answers for anybody with issues that nobody could understand. No matter how the staff tried, they could not keep Rhoda in her room at night. Only to they would go so far as to tie her up with ropes, They chained her to her bed, and in the morning they would find her outside again. The guards were told, keep an eye on this woman, this girl, make sure she's in her room. They'd go check on her, she would be there, and they'd come back an hour later and she'd be gone again. State law said that anybody confined to an asylum, after 2 years, if they were not cured, they would be sent back home to their family. They had no system for long term care. By 1858, Rhoda was back on the family farm. For the following 2 years, she would have severe outbreaks, yelling and screaming. Sometimes she said bad things about Mrs. Phoenix. Other times she would yell about Mr. Scratch. Witches were a constant problem for the young girl. By this time, she was about 23, maybe 24 years old. You can't have a 24-year-old running around the country in her birthday suit. What will the neighbors think? Mental illness was seen as a family issue. Any person who was mentally I'm making up words again. Any person who was mentally unstable probably got it from their family. So it wasn't just the person was unstable, probably the entire family was. And this would make townspeople talk and point. 2,000 years ago, when Galen was in charge of medical treatment of the Roman army, he had some ideas on how to treat men with mental trouble. If a soldier came back from battle suffering from what is now called PTSD, he would be sent to a hospital out in the country. The soldier would be told to go sit on a bench by a fountain. During treatment, the soldier would be given a cup of wine with things added to it, hallucinogenics and things. Nothing real powerful, but enough to make him semi conscious, let's say. As he would sit there in a drug induced haze, a servant would slip up behind him and whisper into one ear, "You're going to be okay. You survived for a reason. It's time to get back to your health and rejoin your unit." The surprising thing is, this worked a lot more often than not. That was back when people didn't know anything about how the mind worked. The mind isn't even understood today. Back in the 1800s, it was not understood at all. Confinement was the most popular treatment for patients who were experiencing either a nervous breakdown or complete craziness. Lock 'em up. That'll fix the problem. When your folks were no longer able to keep her under control, her folks, not yours, when her folks were no lo- your folks had nothing to do with it. When her folks were no longer able to keep her under control and they didn't have the money for any kind of a fancy institution, Rhoda was sent to an almshouse. An almshouse was sometimes called a county home, a public home, or a poorhouse. These were locally administered public institutions that provided housing and health care, sort of, for people who were of limited financial means and were otherwise disadvantaged. The almshouse was often used as a dumping ground for a wide range of disadvantaged and vulnerable people, including those experiencing homelessness, poverty, illness, disability, and it was a lot of discrimination. People convicted of relatively minor crimes were also sent to almshouses, as were orphans, abused and neglected children. Almshouses were often operated in conjunction with a farm, and they met costs through the sale of farm produce. The patients were expected to go out and work the field, and then the produce was sold. As time moved on, almshouses began taking in a wide variety of people. Some were simply mentally challenged, while others were criminally insane. Most houses had no form of segregation between the poor and the crazy. They were all just lumped into one big pile. The almshouse treated Rhoda and other patients inhumanely. For more than 4 decades, Rhoda endured conditions and treatments unsuitable for an animal, much less a human being. If a patient or an inmate was reasonably well behaved, they would be allowed to move about the grounds during the day. At night, there would be a dormitory with as many as 20 or 30 people in a room. Now, if the patient was a problem, oh, say screaming and taking off their clothes, the person would be locked in a tiny room. If isolation didn't do the trick, the confines would include straitjackets, chains, and something called the Utica crib. This treatment required the patient be placed in a narrow, cramped cage. The area was just big enough to hold a person. There was no room to move around. The patient would be locked in for hours or maybe even days until they became sedated, usually due to exhaustion. Once they were worn out and calm, they would be removed from the cage. They also used a rotating chair, which was a popular treatment in the 1800s for mentally ill. It was based on the belief that spinning to induce vertigo, which would cause nausea and vomiting, would purge the person of their illness. Their brain would improve once their stomach was empty. The intensity of the rotation was based on the level of mental illness or the whims of the practitioners. This was so much more advanced than what they did 2,000 years ago. Here, have this drug induced wine, or sit in this chair. We're going to spin you till you puke. The, al- the almshouse where Rhoda found herself held 101 inmates, 36 of whom were considered insane. Rhoda would sometimes manage to act normal for a few days, but this would be followed by more bouts of screaming and running around. She would eat bugs or lizards or anything she could find on the ground. She would still see witches flying around the building. On several occasions, Mrs. Phoenix was seen, only by her, talking to her, telling her all kinds of bad things. When the staff could no longer control Rhoda, she was placed in a wooden box about 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet and spent years naked, locked in a wooden box that was filled with straw. Isn't that what farmers do with chickens? Only these so called doctors were doing it to a person. When she had to go, well, it just kind of stayed there in the box until somebody could push it out with a stick or, well, let's just say it was pretty darn nasty. Mice were found inside the box with her. They had built little nests all over the straw where she was sitting. Her only care was being provided by other inmates who would be assigned to take care of that thing. You go scrape the poo out of that box and don't let the thing out of it. Rhoda sat inside this wooden box with her knees clutched up to her body, but she kept moving the whole time she was in there. Her entire body was covered with bruises from where she was hitting herself against the inside of the box. She removed her own eyes with her fingernails. She also managed to knock out most of her teeth, and still, the only care that she was ever given was by other inmates, other people that had mental illnesses. No nurses, no doctors, just other patients. As part of Illinois' push towards mental health reform in 1902, a Dr. Zeller was named a director of the new Illinois Asylum for the Incurably Insane in Bartonsville. The first thing he did was have all the bars removed from the windows. All the patients' restraints were piled up as a display of how not to treat mentally ill patients. The story of Rhoda was well known throughout Illinois. Dr. Zeller went to investigate and was somewhat appalled by what he found. I don't think appalled is a strong enough word. It's one of those where, had I been there, there would have been some slapping and, well, anyway. Rhoda was finally removed from the box. Her muscles had atrophied so much that her arms and legs no longer worked. She couldn't be straightened out since she had spent over 40 years in the same position. The first order of business was a bath, maybe several baths. I have been around some folks who didn't bathe much, but 44 years of, well, it must have been intense. Rhoda was given a gown and placed in a bed. She remained in the same position as before, but folks that looked at her said she looked a little better. Instead of being placed in a hospital room, Rhoda was moved to one of the cottages that were formerly used by the staff. At some point in time, she began she began using chewing tobacco. If she had no teeth, well, I guess she liked chewing tobacco. I don't know how or when, but she loved the stuff. People would send her care packages from all over the world, and many of them contained chewing tobacco. She would sit on the porch and watch the world go by as her form of entertainment, that and chewing tobacco. Dr. Zeller wanted to work. Dr. Zeller wanted the world to know about this unfortunate person's condition. He invited newspaper reporters to come and see her. Rhoda couldn't see or speak, but she did get a lot of attention both from the press and from the more caring staff. There were so many articles about Rhoda in the newspaper, just about everyone living in Illinois knew about her. She was referred as Rhody by people who had never met her. She became the subject of many discussions. As her popularity grew, nurses would volunteer to be one of the caregivers. It was considered bragging rights to be able to say that you helped take care of Rhody. Treatment went from locked in a box 24/7 to 24/7 attention. No matter how demanding the job became, it was considered the thing for any nurse in Illinois to take care of this no, she's not young anymore, to take care of this woman. Not all the reporters saw her as being a victim. Some painted her as being wildly unhinged creature. A few even hinted that she had been possessed. Rhoda Derry died October 9th, 1906, one day short of her 72nd birthday. More than half her life had been spent in a box. People came from all over Illinois. Yeah. People came from all over Illinois to see her off on her final voyage. All the nurses were there. None had a dry eye. Her grave was given a number instead of a name. It was 217, which was her patient number. Months after her death, nurses began seeing Rhoda sitting on the porch of her cottage. They knew she was dead. They had been at the funeral. So they simply said that this was her spirit. hanging out at her favorite place. 8 years later, her family did pay for a tombstone. I have to ask myself, what the heck was her family doing for 44 years while their family member was locked in a box? Makes you wonder about some people, doesn't it? People still see a woman with her legs pulled up to her chin sitting on the porch of the cottage, even today. Years after her death, the hospital was closed and was turned into an historic site. People visiting the location have reported seeing a woman in a white gown moving around the buildings. Her grave site sits on top of a hill. If you go and stand next to it, you might feel someone tugging on your pant leg. And the smell of chewing tobacco is a constant in and around the area. I have to ask, what went wrong? How did as far as we know, normal 16-year-old girl go so far off the rails? Some would have us believe there was some kind of a chemical imbalance causing her to see and hear things. I've known a few young folks who, having lost their one true love, have gone overboard with their grief. I've seen a few go as far as suicide. Rhoda was far more dynamic in her actions than you would associate with just lost romance. What strikes me as a question unasked is, how did she manage to get out of her room when she was at that first hospital? How did she get past the guards without them seeing her out the front door that was locked as well? And she did this practically every night. The ropes and the chains were never able to keep her in her room. 2 years of escaping without anybody being able to figure out how? Had this been some form of magic, why didn't she ever escape from the box that she was locked in? Did the connection to old Moll Deary have something to do with her opening locked doors? Some folks will say you have to become a witch, while others say that it can be hereditary. Did Rhoda inherit something from her grandmother? Did Mrs. Phoenix curse really have an effect on Rhoda? This would imply that Mrs. Phoenix had some connection to the dark arts herself. Those who have studied the case of Rhoda Deary have come out with several theories, but we may never know the truth. If you find yourself fascinated by the story, you can get the book called 44 Years in Darkness by Sylvia Schultz. You can get it at Amazon.com. It will probably keep you awake at night. Or you just like that sort of thing. Anyway, it's a good book. I recommend you read it. You can also find her on a lot of podcasts and videos. I have this thing about my shows having to be an hour long. I don't know why. The first show was an hour long, and I try to make them all that same length. One time when I interviewed Jeff Stewart, the show was only about 45 minutes. The cell tower near his home was knocked out by a storm, and we were having difficulty getting in contact with each other. There was only so much I could say about being locked in a box, so I added a few stories about odd folks from around the countryside. The Witch of McGregor Road has been said to have started out around the 1980s. If you dig around a bit, you'll find references to a far older story from decades or maybe even a century previous. Like a lot of folklore, if it doesn't get written down right away, the stories get confusing. A woman who was called Beulah is supposed to have been a witch. She lived on McGregor Road in Amberwood, Illinois. The name Beulah in Hebrew means bride or married. But this Beulah never married. Marie Buski was born May 7th, 1907, to parents Richard and Augusta Buski. There were two boys and three girls in the family. Mary was active in several clubs in high school and participated on the swim team. She showed interest in working with children as a teacher very early on. The family was involved in the Calvary Lutheran Church, and Marie, like her sisters, had taught Sunday school there. Marie and her sisters appeared to be quite unladylike in some of their activity. In a newspaper article dated 1925, Marie and her sister Lulu were attending college courses in DeKalb when the girls, along with their roommates, decided they were going to walk home to Rockford. The roommates gave up after only a few miles, but the girls made it all the way to their home. They had accepted a few rides from motorists, but the girls estimated they walked over 22 miles. It took them 5.5 hours to get home. The sisters decided to take the train back down to school, saying that they had already obtained a good deal of their gym credits for the year. Once she had her teaching degree, Marie taught at several schools in the Rockford area. She also continued her work with children through her church and during summer vacation. All of her siblings married and moved away from home, but Marie stayed single, living with her folks in on Prairie Road until they had both died. Her mother 1949 and her father 1958. In 1960, Marie moved into a house on McGregor Road where she lived for most of her remaining life. Stories began to circulate about an old lady living by herself in the woods off of McGregor Road. This woman was a witch who would kidnap children and use them for food, sacrifices, or maybe as slaves. Any kind of bizarre thing that a witch might do with children. The time frame was anywhere around the early 1900s on up to 1980s. Anytime the story was told, a few brave or foolhardy listeners would head out to see if they could spot the old witch who was now being called Beulah. Those who had cars would drive up and down McGregor Road. Seeing as Marie had the only house on the road, well, the witch story became connected to her. Just about everybody knew somebody who knew somebody that had vanished in the area and had somehow been abducted by Beulah. Another version claims that this woman had been a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse that had been located on McGregor Road. While Beulah was teaching one day, the building had caught fire, and some of her students were killed in the blaze. Beulah was so devastated by the fire that she purchased the school and turned it into her home. The parents of the children that she taught held her responsible for their deaths, and they ostracized her. The guilt she felt and the treatment by the locals pushed her over the edge into insanity. She would be seen wandering the woods around her house, calling to the children that had been lost in the fire. Beulah was sometimes accompanied by two large German shepherds. One was all white and the other was all black. There was an article about two men who were arrested for harassing a retired school teacher who lived on McGregor Woods. The 1973 article listed the elderly woman's name as being Marie Buski. How a school teacher became the local witch is kind of bizarre. I have known a few teachers that weren't saints, but they wouldn't go around killing their students and eating them. Marie was 78 years old when she died March 31st, 1986, at the Amberwood Care Center in Rockford, Illinois. We used to have a retired school teacher living in a tent just upriver from the railroad bridge here in Laredo. There's nothing upriver from the bridge except a gravel pit. Well, she lived there. She had lost touch with reality one day, and the world went on without her. She wasn't mean or anything, just kind of off her rocker. She would wander around collecting things valuable to her, but to no one else, and then pile them around her tent. It wasn't really a tent, it was a blue tarp with some sticks holding it up in the air. If she saw one of us agents, she would invite us over to her tent for some tea, which I think was actually just river water. She wanted to visit a nice big glass of brown water. Well, one day she was gone and nobody knows where she went. Perhaps MHMR came and collected her, or maybe she wound up on a bus heading to Zapata. We had more than our share of homeless folks here in Laredo. The reason was a certain big city to our north used to round up all the homeless and put them on a bus heading south. Since Laredo was the end of the line, well, they wound up living here. That's the story I got from the police there. Back in the early 1900s, just outside of Boonville, Indiana, a doctor named Travis D. Scales and his wife Emma built a two-story house out in the woods. They built near the lake with very few neighbors around. They didn't have any kids of their own, but they did employ some folks who did. One of the maids brought her young daughter along as a helper. One night, the doctor and his wife were in town when the house caught fire. It was a total loss, and the maid's daughter died in the blaze. In another story, the maid was a young girl who lived and worked at their house. This was common enough back then. If you didn't have money for school, you worked. Now, school was free for all children, but you had to eat and you had to buy clothes, and if you had no money, well, you had to go get a job. In another slant to the story, the young girl was actually murdered and the house was set on fire to hide the evidence. Whichever the story is, the young girl's name was Annie. The Scales sold their property to the state, creating an area where families could enjoy the great outdoors, and they had a place that was now called the Scales Lake Park. A few years after the fire, around 1920 or so, people in that area started hearing terrifying screams of a woman coming from deep in the woods. Authorities would search the area time and time again, but there was no sign of anyone in distress in the woods. In the 1930s, people began reporting seeing a woman dressed all in black from head to toe, walking along Old Tennyson Road. People who saw the woman in black would slow down, ask if she needed a ride. The woman would simply vanish. Folks began calling her Black Annie. Cars back then had running boards along both sides. On a few occasions, Black Annie would jump onto the side of the car and stand there for a few seconds. If anybody was to look closely, they would see that she didn't have a face. She would ride along the road for a few dozen feet and then jump back off, disappearing from sight. The story of the house fire was mixed in with the story of the woman that the locals thought was a witch. Livestock would simply fall over dead for no known reason. People would get sick, horrible illnesses. The ones that were asked all said that they saw a woman in black, soon to be called Black Annie, just hours before they fell ill. The locals got together and they chased the woman from her home. Soon after this activity, a huge tornado came through the area, killing 30 people and injuring over 300. Immediately after the tornado, people saw Black Annie walking along the path of the destruction, as if she were admiring her handiwork. People began to go missing in the same area, and this was also blamed on Black Annie. Over the years, there have been several reported sightings of Black Annie. Many people say they hear screaming from the woods at night. You're considered brave or foolhardy if you go walking through the woods at night searching for this mysterious being. Black Annie has become a very popular legend in Warwick County. There's even a Black Annie music festival at Scales Lake featuring a haunted trail walk that some folks say is actually haunted. That's a cool thing to have. All the reported sightings of Black Annie have been in the same area, from Old Cemetery down to McLemore Hill. Mary Roth was a baby when she had her first cataleptic fit, what we now call an absentee epileptic seizure. She didn't jerk or jump around, she just stiffened up and sat there, not moving. As she grew up, these seizures grew stronger and lasted longer. When she was finally old enough to speak, she told her parents that she could speak to spirits when she was in one of these trances. As a teenager, Mary gained the ability to read books while blindfolded. Her seizures sometimes would last for hours. In an attempt to relieve the pressure she said that she felt inside her head, Mary would cut herself so that the blood would flow, thus lowering the pressure. Eventually, she began hearing voices and she began speaking in different languages that she had no way of knowing. This is according to her family. Her parents wanted a cure for their daughter, and ultimately they decided to commit her to an insane asylum, hoping that she could be treated. Mary died at the age of 19 in 1865. Mary Laurency Venom was born in 1864 near Watseka, Illinois. In the summer of 1877, she suffered a series of epileptic fits, lapsing into unconsciousness. After awakening, she told her family that she had gone to heaven and had seen angels and had visited her younger brother and sister who had both died before she was born. As her fits became more frequent, physicians advised there was nothing they could do about it. January 1878, it was decided that she should be placed in an insane asylum. She has seizures, so she should go into an asylum. Hmm, good, good thinking there. A neighbor and a devout spiritualist named Asa Roth convinced Venom's parents not to commit her. He instead said that they needed to contact a physician named Winchester Stevens, who was also a spiritualist. Asa Roth just happened to be Mary Roth's father, the girl who had died. 1878, physician and spiritualist Stevens examined Venom. His accounts were published in a book in 1887 called The Watseka Wonder, in which he describes Venom as the most remarkable case of spirit return and manifestation ever recorded in history. According to Stevens, Venom's character would change suddenly from a morose and sullen to mystical and imaginary trances, in which she described trips to heaven and visits with angels. Venom spoke in different voices and became several different people. Sounds like a woman I knew back when I lived in Seabrook. We called her Sybil. She had multiple personality disorder, and she was not faking. I mean, this woman was interesting, to say the least. If you listen or read any of my bag company books, the character named Susie is based on this woman that we called Sybil. Anyway, getting back to the story at hand, uh, she remembered names of several people related to a different family. In fact, she began telling people that during her spells, she became this other woman. She remembered the name of several people who had died and that they possessed her body. Later, she chose to be possessed by the soul of Asa Roth's deceased daughter, Mary Roth. Physical researcher Richard Hodgson, Psychical researcher Richard Hodgson of the American Society for Psychical Research was also convinced that Benham was possessed by Roth's spirit. Venom allowed Mary Roth to possess her body for about 15 weeks, during which time she could recognize all of Roth's family and relatives. She was familiar with all the objects in Roth's house and could recall incidents and stories from Roth's childhood, her past life. Convinced that Venom was the reincarnation of their daughter, the Roth family allowed the girl to live with them for several weeks. When Venom later married, Roth's spirit inhabited Venom on many occasions, including while she was delivering her first baby. This is not the first nor the last time a child was born who had memories from the past life. I did a show about reincarnation back in June of 2018. The girl that I knew when I lived in Seabrook, I didn't really know her, and she wasn't really a girl. She was about 35 years old. She would go into a restaurant, the Seabrook Steakhouse. No, it was it was a steakhouse, but they served hamburgers and things. And she would go in and she would sit down. She would ask for a table for two. And then she would sit there and she would get into an argument with the person sitting across the table from her that none of the rest of us could see. She would get mad and she would stand up and throw down her fork or her knife and she would walk out the door, telling the other person to pay for the meal. Well, the staff at the restaurant knew, oh, it's the Kima Steakhouse right across the river. The staff at the restaurant didn't worry about her walking out the door. They would simply call her parents, and her parents would come by and pay for her meal, both her meals. The girl was definitely interesting. What scares me is the fact that she had two children at home. Oh, they were both being taken care of by her parents also. I don't know whatever happened to this young gal, but she dressed the part. You'd see her dressed up like an old lady, walking with a cane. She had a dress came down below her knees, and she had the clunky old style high heels. Or she would dress up like a young girl with a t-shirt and short pants, and she'd be skipping along the side of the highway, and it was the same woman. Anyway, back to the show. Vic also sent me an idea on how the boys in the white lab coats can be absolutely nasty and get away with it, all in the name of science. The monster study was conducted by Dr. Wendell Johnson, who was a speech pathologist, so he could learn more about why children would stutter. Johnson developed the monster study to see if stuttering was a result of a learned behavior or if it was biological. Dr. Johnson conducted his not so nice study in 1936 at the University of Iowa. Ethics were not a consideration. They're now a yikes. It was not a consideration like they would be today. If this experiment, I just had a cat go flying past me. If this experiment had been proposed today, the researcher may have been stopped before they even began. Had they gone ahead with this study, somebody would wind up in jail and there would be a number of lawsuits. Johnson chose 22 orphans as his participants. About half of these kids would stutter, while the other half had normal speech. The orphans were split up into two groups with stutterers and non stutterers, in both groups. One of these groups were labeled normal speakers, even though some of the kids stuttered. The others were labeled as stutterers, even with half of this group not having speech difficulties. Throughout the course of the experiment, the children were treated according to which group they were labeled as belonging to. Johnson's team met with the children every few weeks for 5 months to evaluate their speech. Children in the normal group were praised of their ability to speak well, even if they actually stuttered. The children in the stuttering group were told that their speech was poor. They were told things like, you must try to stop yourself from stuttering. Don't ever speak unless you can do it correctly. The children who were labeled normal weren't affected much by the researchers' efforts. There was improvement in only one child who had stuttered. Children in the stuttering group fared far worse. Of the 6 children that were falsely chastised for their speech, 5 developed speech problems. Reports show that these children became withdrawn and some stopped speaking altogether. Johnson and his colleagues frequently conducted studies on themselves and willing adult subjects in the name of finding a cure for stuttering. Other colleagues worried that the use of orphans was crossing the line. Johnson wasn't the only person conducting studies on marginalized groups of people. The Nazis also did it. What surprises a lot of people is to learn that they got their best ideas from doctors here in the United States. Using orphans as test subjects is one thing. Using minors in a study without their consent or knowledge, well, that's way over the line. Even the staff at the orphanage were unaware of what was really going on. This left many of the stutterers with unresolved psychological trauma. Researchers knew that this was a possibility. One member of Johnson's team wrote, I believe that in time they will recover, but we certainly made a definite impression on them. An impression? Now, how about you ruined their lives? The students, aka the guinea pigs, their schoolwork suffered as well. One of the orphans ran away from home, the home that she was staying in. She said that the study had ruined her life. The orphans didn't know what they were a part of a study until 60 years after it had happened. Only a handful of speech pathology students at the University of Iowa learned about the study. They kind of buried it in the back room so that nobody would know the evils that they had participated in. The information was useful. Well, that's what they tried to say. However, most people that have looked at the information say that there was absolutely no benefit to anyone from this study. That's why today they refer to it as the monster study. The monster study didn't become nationally known until 2001. Some tried to say that they needed to do this study. Others said that they had crossed so many ethical boundaries that there was absolutely no justification for what they had done. The University of Iowa issued a formal apology, a big deal, a formal apology, as all of this made national news. Subjects started to learn the truth about what had happened to them. 3 of the subjects in the stutterer group sued the University of Iowa for emotional distress and fraudulent misrepresentation. The estates of 3 of the other stutterers were also included in this lawsuit. The plaintiffs claimed that the impact of the study had long lasting repercussions. They won their settlement, and the University of Iowa paid $1 million to the victims or their estates, most of which probably went to lawyers. The study should never be repeated, but it shouldn't be swept under a rug either. Those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. Today, out there somewhere, is some guy in a white lab coat looking for unethical backers to perform some nasty research into God only knows what. More than likely, the backers will be our own government. They seem to really like this sort of thing. I include the next story because of something Vic said during the show Paranormal Rundown. In Boston in 1970, kids began talking about being chased or followed by clowns, sometimes several of them. The one constant was they were always in a white van. The van would pull up alongside one or two kids walking to school. The driver would ask if they wanted a ride. If the kids began to run, the van would follow them. It would only drive away once other people, usually adults, came on the scene. When the police were told about this ongoing problem, they began putting a few more patrols in the area. Most people thought the kids were just making this up. No one was ever questioned about this activity. In the fall of 1991, kids were talking about something scary going on in Chicago. A man dressed up like a clown was driving around in a white van. He was trying to entice young kids to join him in the van. There's no mention of any kids actually getting in with him, but how many kids disappear each year? Anytime a white van would go by, all the kids would stop and watch, trying to see who was driving. If they didn't see the driver, the idea would spread that this was the clown looking for kids. Being a bunch of school kids, they began calling the driver Homie the Clown after the TV character played by Damon Wayans. Just stop and look down any street. How many white vans do you see? It is the most popular color. Most companies that use vans will buy white vehicles. They're the cheapest. It didn't take long before everybody knew someone who knew someone that had disappeared at the hands of Homie. In 2016, in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, police received several calls about a man dressed like a clown trying to get kids to follow him into the woods. He had offered them candy if they would go with him. Instead, the kids ran home and they told their families. This happened at about 8 or 8:30 at night. The kids had been at a local park playing when the clowns stepped out of the trees and began calling to them. The police searched the wooded area near the park, but they didn't find anyone dressed as a clown or not. According to two kids, the man had on white coveralls, white gloves, red shoes with a red bushy hair. His face was painted white and he had a red nose. They told police that he had offered them treats if they would go into the woods with him. Police said an adult heard the man but didn't actually see him. Witnesses say the man ran away from the area before the officers arrived. 4 hours after the first call, Winston-Salem police received a second series of calls about a man in a clown costume around 12:30 at night. Oh, in the morning. No one was ever arrested or questioned as to what was going on. 2022, people in Newcastle, England began hearing about a clown in a white van. He was patrolling the streets around the elementary school asking kids if they wanted a ride. Children would show up for class in the morning and tell their teachers that they had seen this clown on their way to school. Some said there was just one clown in the van, and others said there were two or three. The parents got a hold of the authorities and demanded extra patrols around their schools. As far as any reports go, no one was ever arrested or even questioned about these incidents. A few people remember back in 2016 there had been similar activity around the school. Somebody dressed like a clown had been terrorizing children on their way to class. This person would jump out from the bushes and act as if he was going to grab them. Nobody knows of anyone ever kidnapped, but like I said before, how many kids disappear each year without a trace? In a knee jerk reaction, the authorities began saying that these reports were all just kids being kids in a lead up to Halloween. The self proclaimed fact checkers say none of these reports are true. It was all just made up by the kids. You would almost get the impression that these fact checkers are trying to help the clown in the white van go unnoticed so they can continue looking for children to grab. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell people you don't even know that they should be listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And like I said, if you liked my show, perhaps you want to check out the Trailer Park Terrors. Uh, like I said, similar to what I would do if I had a higher education, better equipment, and paid more attention to what I was doing. He doesn't have the mistakes that I do. Anyway, until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.